All right, welcome back to the Weekly Boost this week. As we, alluded to and promised, we welcome guests back to the show. This week, we're had the pleasure to talk to John Corcoran. He's co-founder and CEO of Rise25, and he'll get into this, but it's a company designed basically to help businesses connect and get return on investment for podcasts and a lot of development, things like that. He's a former White House speechwriter, I saw. He's authored several books, and we'll talk about that as well. But without further ado, welcome, John. Pleasure to
Hey,
have
Ben
you.
and Austin, thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, when we first got connected through a prior guest, we'll talk about a little bit with this idea of connections and making the world a smaller place. I noticed that on your website, and I really liked that idea. So I guess we'll start here. Like, what exactly does Rise25 do for podcasts?
Sure, yeah. Basically what we do is we help primarily B2B businesses to build better relationships in the world. And, we're recording this in April of 2021, and we've all been kind of sheltering in place for the last year. And it's been hard to build relationships, new relationships, because we don't have the usual assets. We don't have get-togethers. We don't have conferences if you go to conferences. And so more people are turning to a tool like podcasts. And I've been doing it for 11 years now. My business partner for about the same amount of time. And I've just not found any other better tool for connecting with amazing people and building your network strategically. And so that's what we help companies to do, with the focus on making sure that they're getting ROI out of it.
Yeah, the idea of, so I'm going through my first semester of grad school in a Zoom university world, right? And there's so many other students that are going through the same thing, but it's so hard to make those connections without that in-person thing, and it's ironic because Austin and I started this in August, excuse me. And, we've been able to open doors that we didn't think we could. And I really like that we've been able to kind of build those types of skills, but it'll be interesting to be able to do some of these in-person connections and connecting and see how podcasting as a whole goes from there.
Yeah, for sure. That's a nice benefit of it. Once you've connected with someone virtually, then go and connect with them in person. I remember years ago, I interviewed Dan Pink, who's the author of Drive and To Sell Is Human and a bunch of other best-selling books. And he and I we were both at the White House around the same time. I was interning in the speechwriting office. He was a speechwriter, but we didn't really know each other. And I connected through doing a podcast, interviewing him over video, Zoom like this, mm-hmm. right? And then I went down to his book signing. This was like a month or two later, not expecting that I would get a chance really face to face or anything like that. And when I got there, there's like 500 people there. I was like, oh man, I have no chance of connecting with this guy. And so I go there, and then afterwards there's a book signing, and I get in line. I wait to come up to the front. I get up to the front. Someone steps aside, and I reach forward to introduce myself, and he looks at me and he says, "Hey, John." And what was so cool about that moment is I realized I already had somewhat of a relationship with him. I already built a bit of a relationship with him because I had done this podcast interview. And since that point, I've just done it over and over again, because you can build relationships and you can meet up with someone at a conference. You go watch them speak. If they're speaking, you're speaking. You can meet up. It can be something small. It can be meet up with someone for coffee. If you're coming through their city, if they're coming through your city, there's all kinds of, great things that come from it. My business partner and I connected through podcasting. I've been to people's weddings who I connected with through podcasting. So many amazing relationships have been attributable to using the podcast strategically. And actually, I think it's a huge time saver, because a lot of people go to networking events where they're trying to meet people, mm-hmm. and it's boring, and you end up getting stuck talking to someone that you really don't have any interest in. And you're 45 minutes talking to this person, you don't know how to excuse yourself and go talk to someone else. You decide who you're going to talk to. And that's what's wonderful about it, because you can be really deliberate, really intentional, and you can build your network the way that you want it to be built.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a more in-person or more personal, like LinkedIn profile, if you will. Like, you choose who you want to talk to. And, we've reached out to people. Like, I'll be reading a book for grad school, and I'll reach out to the author and be like, hey, really enjoyed your book. If you have time to come talk about it, great. If not, oh well. And just got a response this week that said, sorry, we're really backed up. But you never know when you might need to connect with someone, or if you end up at a conference, like you said. In my case, in my field, it'll be talking about a paper that I write or whatever. And you never know where those, connections are going to take you, or what doors are going to open up for you.
Yeah, and
really
keep
like
doing that. I mean, yeah, one person says no, but lots of other people will say yes,
Exactly.
and it builds momentum. After you get a couple of others under your belt, then, others will say yes. So, you can kind of
Mhm.
stair step your way up. Once you get a couple of other respected authors, and then you report that back to the subsequent people, you say, hey, I've interviewed this person and this person and this person. Then all of a sudden they're like, oh, wow, I want to be included in that same sentence, or I want to be
Mhm.
featured on that same podcast as those people. Like about a month ago, I interviewed the original co-founder and CEO of Netflix. You've heard of Netflix, right? Little company,
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
Here and
most of
there.
tiny
us have
one.
heard of it, right?
Yeah.
Ever since that point, I've told everyone, because like if I say to someone, would you like to be a guest on my podcast? About a month ago, I was interviewing the CEO of Netflix. What are they going to say? No, I'm too busy. Like,
Yeah,
oh,
exactly.
the guy from Netflix said okay. The co-founder of Netflix said okay, but you're too busy, or it's not good enough for you, or something.
Yeah.
Then no one's asking about your downloads. They're not asking about like what you, by the way, an interesting point about downloads. I talked to someone the other day. I was explaining the concept of downloads in the context of podcast to someone. He said, what's downloads? I was like, well, that's how podcasts are kind of measured, by downloads. He's like, oh. And I realized we're in a streaming world now. People don't even consider things to be downloaded to a physical device. They just
Yeah.
consider it streaming. So like he didn't even care about the concept of downloads at all. So that's the reason I mentioned that, is because a lot of times people who are hesitant to get started, if they've heard of the idea that you have to get a certain number of downloads, that holds them back. They think like, oh, there's no way I could get enough downloads that other people will be interested in being guests on my podcast. But that doesn't matter. And it matters less in a streaming world.
Yeah, I'm happy that you mentioned that, because I feel like Ben and I have this conversation almost every other episode about like worrying about whether or not people are going to enjoy what we're talking about or what the guest has to say. And we've kind of looked at it like we don't necessarily care about like the numbers, the metrics, the logistics of it. We care about the message that's being portrayed by us, our guests, and what the podcast stands for. And it's empowering to know that we can like have somebody on our show, do all the dirty work behind the scenes, like reaching out, setting everything up, and then come together and make a product and be proud of the product, regardless of what the numbers say, and regardless. So
yeah, and you know what? I mean, it's so wildly inaccurate. There's different reporting numbers out there. There's different platforms. People are sharing things on social these days, so it becomes micro content, and so the download numbers don't even matter. Plus, there's the relationship piece, right? I mean, I try and then introduce my guests to other guests, and I've had guests who've started businesses together. They've been a guest on my show, then I introduce them to someone else, and they start a business together. Yeah. So who cares how many downloads their episode got? Yeah. They got tremendous value out of that relationship. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I say to people all the time, don't worry about it. Don't even check it. It doesn't even matter. Or another way of putting it is just think first about, how is this going to be valuable? This process of it going to be valuable to me. Mm-hmm. And if it's valuable to you, then if you get a big audience, that's great. If you don't get a big audience, that's fine too. Some people will find it and others won't, and that's fine. You don't need to compete with the Joe Rogans of the world. The problem is I see a lot of people who start a podcast and then they get really dismayed if they're not hitting download numbers, or they're checking their stats all the time, and they're expecting that all their self-worth is all tied up in that. And it just doesn't matter. Take the time. If you, over the course of the next year, do a podcast a week, that's 52 weeks, you do 52 interviews, and you're strategic about it, and you are intentional, and you interview like you mentioned, Ben, if you interview books, authors of books that you admire, or a speaker or a business owner that you look up to, and you get tidbits of wisdom from them, and maybe you introduce them to someone, maybe they introduce you to someone, and you get an insight or an idea or a realization or an aha moment that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise. That discipline, that function of doing that is going to be tremendously valuable to you, alone. Yeah. So I tell people that all the time, and that's why I'm so passionate about it.
Yeah. And you can hear it too, like in your voice. And this idea, we talk about it like behind the scenes too, off the air with Austin and I, is this idea of showing up. Like you said, if you put out 52 episodes, you don't know where, like you said, be strategic about who you're, picking and what you're trying to do as like a podcast mission. Like it's hard to kind of talk about a podcast having like a mission statement, right? Like it's just two guys talking about whatever, but like showing up every week and putting out a product, like Austin said, that we're proud of, that we, that's just as beneficial for us. And like you said, it's a platform that gives you this some sort of authority to reach out to people, like you said, that you would never have, like, catch somebody in passing, like, hey, you want to catch a cup of coffee? That's so easy to blow off. But when you say, hey, I interviewed this person, this person, this person, would love to have, pick your brain about whatever for a half hour, like that holds a lot more weight than, blowing off a cup of coffee at Starbucks or wherever.
Yeah. And especially for the busier people get, as people get busier, their time's more valuable. They're more judicious about what they spend their time on. And so they're less likely to say yes to a get to know you, unless it's someone who they perceive to be worth that time. So, good luck getting a CEO of a publicly traded company to stop and be interviewed on podcast, but I've had them be a guest on my podcast. Or rather, sorry, I said that wrong. Good luck getting the CEO of a publicly traded company to stop and just give you like a cup of coffee or just like talk to you if you're not recording it for a podcast. But if you are recording it for a podcast, you're still having that conversation. You're still getting to know them. They're getting to know you. But you're capturing it, you're recording it, you're uploading it to web. It's going to be up on the internet. It's going to help give them additional exposure. It's going to give them backlinks back to their website. So there's a lot of value to it. So people are much more likely to say yes to it. There are billionaires, many billionaires, who do podcasts. They have their own podcasts. Why do they do it? Because oftentimes they're interviewing someone on the other end that is very busy. And it's a discipline that forces both of them to slow down, stop, and have a conversation. And great things come from those sorts of conversations.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. This idea of podcasts being an extension of businesses, I'm glad you brought that up. Do you kind of see that as like a common thing now? We saw it with Picture This, and we've seen it with other places too. Like, I'm interested. I spent a couple days in Boston like a year and a half ago, and we went to the JFK like library and museum, and they have their own podcast. So a lot of times it's these extensions. Like, are you seeing that like more generally in the podcasting sphere?
Absolutely. I mean, Gary Vaynerchuk says that every business needs to have a podcast, just like every business has a website.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like 15 years ago, not every business had a website because maybe they didn't see the value of it. But now, most businesses realize they need to have a website. Same thing with a podcast. I would even argue that it's more important because, a website in many cases is just kind of a pamphlet. It's an online pamphlet, just information about what you do. It's kind of like setting the bar, but it doesn't do anything more. Whereas a podcast, when people listen to you on a podcast, they get to know you in a much deeper way. And if you are featuring people, which you should be, if you're interviewing people, which you should be on your podcast, then you are networking at the same time as you're creating content, at the same time as you are educating the world about who you are and what you do. It's all of those things. It's business development, it's referral marketing. It makes you more referable because it's way easier. I'm a big connector. I love introducing people, but it's way easier for me to introduce people when there's a podcast because I can just say, hey, Joe, you got to meet Jane because Jane has got this great podcast. I don't know if she has, capacity to interview right now. It's up to her, but Joe, I think you'd be a good fit for what it's worth. So I think you guys should connect. And they're much more likely to connect when that is in there. So it makes you more referable. It's a tool for business development. It's a tool for content marketing. It's a tool for personal and professional development. That should not be minimized because some of the amazing insights that I've had over the last 11 years have come from talking to a smart person, asking them questions over a podcast. Mm-hmm. It's a tool for SEO value because you get backlinks back to your website, creating fresh content, which Google loves on your website. So many great benefits to it.
Yeah. I feel like a podcast is a great like 3D version of what you're trying to say, like about your product, or it's another way for somebody to relate to a product without either having to go and buy it or have to like read about it on the website or online. You can hear like the real life story, the real life expressions, emotions of the people that either are behind the idea or, trying to promote it as best as possible and whatnot. And for us, our product is just conversation. And like you've been saying, over and over again about how important it is just to connect and to have conversations with people and start these things up because you don't know where these relationships could take you, your guests, or your audience. And I feel like podcasting and like that future direction of it is going to emphasize that idea of it being a more tangible service for people to promote about their business and about for them to give more of an insight as to what they stand for, rather than seeing and reading a mission statement on a website as like a header, or, getting a newsletter every once in a while from a, company or something like that, explaining what's going on. I feel like the more and more people are getting into podcasts, the more and more businesses revolving as well as evolving around this idea.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned the idea of having a product. Admittedly, most people do have a product or a service, at least in our world when we help B2B businesses. And I'm not talking about, other types of podcasts that are, fiction podcasts or, true crime or something like that. But, in the B2B space, they usually have a product or a service. But I tell people all the time, look, there's no better way to figure out what your product or your service should be than to network strategically in the industry you want to be in, and to ask great questions that you're curious about to intelligent people. And that's what the podcast allows you to do. And so even if you don't have a product yet, even if you haven't figured out what your service is, even if you're not sure where your career is going to go, I think it's still super valuable. It takes the place of informational interviews, which are fundamentally an inconvenience for the person you're asking for, right? I think it's horrible advice for, career counseling officers to say, go out and do informational interviews. If you can do a podcast instead, or if you can interview them and you can promote them, because that is way, way, way more valuable to that person, and it's less of an inconvenience to them. If you are going out doing informational interviews, you're fundamentally inconveniencing that person, and you really owe them one after that, rather than them owing you. Yeah. And when you do a podcast and you promote someone, and then you put it on social and you put it on iTunes, then in a subtle way, it's the principle of reciprocity. They actually want to reciprocate. They owe you one. And so they will then want to do more for you. They will want to introduce you to their network. They will want to help, in other ways, maybe hire you, other things like that. So it's a fundamental shift, and it's much preferable, much better off.
Yeah, you're talking about like some of the benefits of podcasting, and obviously Ben and I are at the forefront of, having conversations with people and like enjoying these experiences. And one of the things that I feel like it's really put onto us is the idea that we can learn through other people's experiences instead of us trying to seek out these experiences on our own. We can hear these people's stories and like understand what they've gone through or what they're currently going through, and sort of generate, I don't want to say a product, but more or less a conversation that revolves around that. And I'm not saying we were naive to that beforehand, but the amount of just difference there is out there, and like how we can encompass that in something that we both enjoy doing, it's remarkable that this outlet exists, and we're grateful for it. And it's kind of funny how we just stumbled upon the idea, but it sometimes that's all it takes, is just that chance that like, hey, we're gonna start something. We don't really know where this is gonna go, but looking back at it now, we wouldn't be who we are today without it. And I feel like that's a really important lesson. I feel if anybody can take a lesson from this, it's that, right, is being able to do what you love.
In many ways, it's democratized the means of communication and being your own media company. I mean, these days, any company can be their own media company, and it doesn't need to take extra time. And that's what a lot of people don't realize, is that the podcast, if you do it right, and if you're not stuck in the weeds on it, and you delegate pieces, the majority of it, so you can focus your time and energy on having great conversations, it actually saves you time, because it gets you access to higher and higher caliber of people, and it's a way of delivering value with people. So it's super valuable in that sense, and it gives you just an amazing tool for connecting with people.
I'm really happy you brought up the word delegate, because that's something that I struggled with. I told this kind of mini story last week, I think. But I, was basically a supervisor of a small lab before I went back to school. And I just had a really hard time delegating things, because obviously, like, you're the one that's responsible for it. Or like in our case, like, we're the ones that are putting out, it's a harder example to pull with this, with just us and I. But like, I noticed, so did your podcast start before your company?
Yeah, so
Okay.
the kind of the backstory is I was practicing lawyer for many years actually, and
Okay.
I started with I had a client who came to me for a very tiny matter. They just wanted me to write a lease on a spare bedroom in their house. These days you'd put it on Airbnb, and back then it wasn't around. So I did that, and then I researched the guy. It turns out he was a serial entrepreneur and started a bunch of companies, some of which had gone public. So kind of on a whim, I said, "Can I have 20 minutes of your time? I'd love to interview you over the phone. I'll record it, publish it to the web." Didn't even know how to do that at the time. And I did. And then at the end, he was like, "This is really great. Can I, do you have some time? I got some other legal projects maybe you could do." And I was like, "Well, that worked really well. Let's just keep on doing this."
Yeah.
And so, flash forward today, I kept on doing it. So yes. So the point is, first 6 or 7 years of doing a podcast, I told everyone I knew, you should do a podcast. It's amazing. It's a benefit to your life. You should do it. Absolutely. And 99% of those people who I told that never did anything because they had all kinds of different objections. They focused on the wrong things, like spending hours and hours researching what microphone they should buy when they should be focusing on how they're going to use it to build relationships with the right people, those sorts of things. Yeah. And so ultimately we ended up getting into this space because we were sick and tired of people making excuses for why they couldn't do it. And we'd had a team that we'd trained in all our processes, and we had the strategy down. And so ultimately we just started helping other people. But delegation is an incredibly important point. Delegation is a skill. It's one that you have to nurture and develop over time. It's not easy from the get-go. I'm constantly trying to sharpen that saw and get better at it. It helps, of course, when you have a profit motive behind it, because otherwise, if you're doing it as, a hobby or something, then it's money out of your pocket, or you're going to view it that way. When you have a podcast that's associated with a business that's going to result in some kind of benefit for that business, whether it's new clients in the door or whatever, then you start to see, okay, delegating this, taking this stuff on my plate, one, it doesn't drain my energy. And two, it gives me more space and bandwidth to focus on the stuff that I can't delegate, like me having a great conversation with a great prospect or referral partner. And then all the other stuff can be handled by someone else.
Yeah. And I also wanted to ask you, like, were there any challenges to, starting a business as a co-founder, right? Because was it hard to get like on the same page? It sounds like you guys are like share the same vision for what, what you wanted to help and make these things easier for people to start their own podcast. But were there any like decisions that were difficult to come to, like same page wise or things like that?
I mean, there's always things that you gotta have good communication with your co-founder. It's a marriage in many ways, so there's always things that you have to figure out. Who's handling what and who's responsible for what. That kind of stuff comes up all the time. So you fundamentally have to have a good relationship with your co-founder, which is great because Jeremy and I, we just like think 99% alike when it comes to strategies around using a podcast. Even though he and I mean, the first 4 or 5 years of doing a podcast, we didn't really know each other that well. I was aware of him doing his, and he was aware of mine at the same time, and we kind of knew each other. But it wasn't until about 5 or 6 years ago that we ended up going to a conference, the same conference, and getting to know each other. And that's where the seeds of our business was born. But I mean, I ran a business on my own without a co-founder. Way better off having a co-founder. I much prefer it because it's kind of like 2 + 2 = 10. Or 1 + 1. What is the saying? 1 + 1 = 10 or something like that. Well, I don't know what it is, but the point is, like, combined, your skills add up to a heck of a lot more.
Yeah. Sorry. Did you want to move on to, well, I'll go back a little bit because I wanted to, you've been doing podcasting for, 10 years or so. Is there a particular interview or a handful of like a theme that you particularly enjoy interviewing someone and kind of picking their brain about as you kind of like reflect back?
Mine's evolved a lot. It's the same name that 11 years ago I was interviewing people using the same name, same podcast. Back then I was practicing law. I was interviewing my legal clients. I was interviewing other attorneys in the community. I was interviewing other business owners in my local community. And eventually I started radiating out and, interviewing authors and speakers and business owners outside of my community. But, for me, it's evolved and changed. And that's what's wonderful about it is it can evolve and change. I talk to people all the time that say like, oh, I can't do a podcast now because I haven't figured out what the name is of it, or I haven't figured out what I would focus on, or I need to just figure out my niche or something. And look, I know of no better tool out there than using the podcast to have great conversations. That will help you figure out, who do you enjoy connecting with? Who do you enjoy talking to? Who do you enjoy, working with? It helps you with all of those things, having those great conversations. So there's no one theme, I would say, that I really enjoy, but the niche of my podcast is really focusing on, I interview successful entrepreneurs and I ask them what relationships got them where they are today. So I ask them a lot about mentors. I ask them about business partners. I ask them about key clients. I ask them about referral partners on the way. How did they build those key relationships? And how did that help them get to where they are today? And so that's kind of the theme that I always come back to. And it's nice having a theme like that just is kind of a constant thread throughout it.
Yeah, I know Austin and I struggled with this, with naming ours too. It's like we spent, I think, one day on it, right? When we had that legal pad of just brainstorming ideas. And, it's less about that. Like, it's about the connections and the content that you're putting out there. And I think that's a really important thing to consider too. Cause it's like, who cares about the name? Because the name is what you make it at the end of the day, right? Because when they see, in our case, the Weekly Boost, they're going to know that we're going to talk about these certain things and bring people on to talk about, life in general, or, all these things. It's not necessarily about, pinning it down to, something super specific.
Yeah. Honestly, like the name, I don't think is that significant. I tell people all the time, look, you can call it Ben and Austin's podcast. Like, it doesn't matter because no one's like saying no to being on a podcast just because of the name of it, unless it's like really far afield. I mean, the funny thing, I was a guest on a podcast that was aimed at middle-aged women, helping them to learn how to date more men or have better quality dates or something like that. And I was, they were asking me about relationship building. How do you build better relationships? And that was kind of the connection, but it was a little bit odd, I have to admit it. But most of the time, the name of the podcast is completely insignificant for the reason that we talked about earlier when I was talking about the Netflix founder. If I say to people, which I do all the time, and this is in my outreach messaging, I say, like, some of my past guests include the co-founder and original CEO of Netflix, and CEOs and entrepreneurs from YPO, EO, Lending Tree, Activation Blizzard, Open Table, just I mentioned a bunch of companies that they've heard of before. Mm-hmm. And what are they going to say when I say something like that? They're not going to be like, well, if those people said yes, then how could I possibly say no? And they're not going to ask any more questions beyond that, or rarely do they. Mm-hmm. It's just like, I was a guest on another podcast once where I remember when it was published, totally coincidentally, I was like the next episode or 2 episodes later after an interview with Tony Robbins. And how do you think I felt when that was published? I felt like $1 million. I was like, holy crap, I am the next guest, or 2 guests later. I screenshotted it, sent it to my mom, I mean, it was like, wow, I made it, And so it's that proximity that makes people feel great, makes them feel like they're inside of that club. So you could call it Ben and Austin's podcast, and you can say, we are doing an interview featuring top biochemists, or top biochemists from the Midwest, mm-hmm. or top historians from the greater Wisconsin area. Mm-hmm. And you get, first of all, when you get a couple of people that fit that criteria, especially if other people would know that person's name, and then you reach out to a third and a fourth person and you say, I've featured this person and this person, and they know them, and they're like, I want to be part of that group. Pretty soon their competitive juices starts flowing, and they're like, oh, wow, geez, I want to be included in that, And so it's really cool to see that happen.
Yeah, I really like that. I'm writing that down now, like creating this like niche of guests, right? That you can use for your own, guest acquisition later on. Right. I noticed from your website, you worked with Chuck E. Cheese. We have a previous beef with them from, a couple episodes back. Where we're just scarred for life from the live animatronic mouse. But I just had to add it in there for our third co-host, Michael. It's funny.
That was actually my business partner interviewed Nolan Bushnell who was the founder of Chuck E. Cheese.
Oh, wow.
And the founder of Atari, which is kind of crazy that he founded Atari and Chuck E. Cheese.
Yeah.
But yeah, those animatronic,
Yeah.
those animatronic guys up at the front of the room that are like just sitting there lifeless.
Yeah,
and
no,
then
thanks.
all of a sudden the music starts and they start jerky moving around and stuff like that. It freaks me out.
I was on my way home from OKC last weekend, and Chuck E. Cheese was still like bumping. So they're doing something right, you know?
Yeah.
Wow.
They rebranded a couple
They're not open
times
in our area. They're not reopening
Oh,
our
really?
area. No, I mean, well, first I'm in Northern California, so everything's been shut down forever.
Yeah.
Okay.
But secondly, I mean, geez, talk about a germ cesspool. Like I'm not going back into that place for a while. It's a bunch of kids running around. They put their mouth on everything, put their mouth on the arcade games and stuff like that. Ugh, yeah.
One of the things that I've found with podcasting, and this is kind of a little more humorous and informal, it's a great icebreaker into a conversation with people. I've been asked numerous times, I guess, in class participation situations where they're like, "Oh, what do you like to do for fun?" Or you're just talking to somebody, meeting them for the first time, like, "Oh, you do a podcast? What's it about?" And it's an immediate just referral, or it's immediate reference to that, and it gets the conversation going, and then can accumulate into a conversation with maybe somebody they know that could be on the show. Like we've had people talk about, hey, maybe you should have this person on there because like they're my aunt or my uncle, or they're my my brother's fiance or something like that has something pertinent to our mission and our statement. And just by simply saying, hey, I kind of do this little thing for fun, and I've had the X, Y, and Z people on here, like here, see what you think.
The one caveat I would make with that is one of the big mistakes I see people make is they are not discriminating enough in who they interview on the podcast. They'll just take anyone. And then it gets worse when you've been doing it for a little while, and then you start getting incoming solicitations from PR reps who just want to get their people onto different podcasts. And then you accept some of those and you realize those are not a great fit. So you really got to be clear about why are you doing this, and if no one was listening, would this be worthwhile doing, because the thing is your network will grow. The people that the connections that you have will grow and evolve over time. Some people come, some people will go, whether you do a podcast or not. And you can be deliberate and intentional about it, or you can let it just happen to you. It can be just total happenstance. And pretty soon your network is just the guy who you went to college with, and the guy who was your neighbor, and the person you used to work with. And you have no control over that. And they're not necessarily, they might be good people. I'm not talking about friendships. They might be good people, but they're not really strategically valuable for you as you advance in your career or you advance with your business. Or you can be deliberate and intentional about it. So be discriminating. If you do a weekly podcast, that's only 52 people a year that you can select. So don't interview, be very discriminating and be respectful of their time and yours.
Yeah.
And it's okay to have a little bit of leeway, have a little bit of, this one might be kind of fun, or this one might be kind of interesting. Maybe they don't exactly fit, but start to, be clear on what you're going for and why you're doing it, so that your network is growing as the podcast is growing and as you're doing it.
Yeah, that gets back to also what your uncle said about having these core values. Like I mentioned earlier, like as weird as it is to say about like us just like sitting down weekly and having a conversation, that's important because it's nice to get some of the support where it's like, oh, like you should have me come on. You should have me come on, like from our friends too, even. But it's like, we have to make sure that conversation is something that's still going to be, like you said, strategic. And I think that's a really big word to take from this conversation too, is deliberate and strategic in how you approach growing your podcast, because your network is obviously going to evolve over the years. It's just putting yourself in a better position where you don't know what door is going to be open for you based on the work that you do now in the first year of our podcasting, let's say.
Yeah, for sure.
I did want to transition a little bit to, because you've authored several books. I don't exactly know how many it is, but the book writing process itself, it looks a lot different than for me, because for me, it'll be, if I get into a PhD program, it'll be, an adaptation of my dissertation. It'll be my first book thing. But like, what types of like research and caveats from the book writing process can you kind of share for someone who's, looking into, writing for a big part of what my profession will end up being?
Yeah, I mean, so there's so many different kinds of books out there. There are books for different purposes, from children's books to novels to nonfiction. And, a book that's based on a dissertation is a completely different animal from what I've done. So you really have to ask yourself, why am I doing this? I see a lot of people that want to write a book because that's the feather in your cap. That's the way that people kind of denoted significance or felt like they had significance and authority. And it also serves it as social proof, which is basically saying, okay, this person's published a book. They're an author. Therefore, they have authority. They're an expert. And a lot of times people don't need any more of that. They don't need any more authority. They don't need any more social proof. Or a lot of times what people pursue in their career and their business, they pursue more of what they've already done well enough, rather than pursuing or challenging themselves with the things that they need to get better at, that they are not strong in. I'm not saying you pursue your weaknesses, not at all. You should pursue your strengths. But what I'm saying is that there's some area that you need to improve, and getting more of social proof or getting better at sales, if you're really good at sales, maybe is not the thing that you need to focus on. So as far as writing a book that's based on a dissertation, that's a completely different animal. And I haven't written one. I have a Juris Doctorate, not a PhD or, whatever you're going to be getting. So I can't, and we didn't have to write one. Thank God, no dissertation for us. I had to take the bar exam, but as far as, writing a book goes, I actually recommend to many people, if you just want to have a book, and if you can divorce yourself from your perfectionist tendencies, which isn't easy, then what you're doing right now, doing a podcast, is a great way to start to get into it, because you can, and we do this for clients. We're doing this right now for one of our clients, where they're partnering with a big name business book author. I can't mention their name, but someone you would have heard of.
Mm-hmm.
And it would basically just outline it in advance. So we talk about, okay, what's your expertise? What are some areas you can talk about? We just brainstorm. Okay, here you can talk about this and this and this and this and this and this. And then we put it in an outline in a logical order. And each of these different topics become short little chapters or sub-chapters. And then we go through and we just interview them on that topic, and we just talk it out. We share stories and examples and talk it out. And pretty soon you've got a book, and if that's what you want, if you want to have a book, there's huge value to having a book. It makes it easier for you to be a guest on other podcasts. I can say, as being a podcaster, when you interview someone who has a book, it makes the podcaster's job a lot easier, because they can just follow that table of contents. It's very clear. They know what you're about. They know what you're going to talk about, and they can interview you on it. And it's a great calling card. It's a great business card, basically. So I wouldn't profess to say how to create that kind of scholarly level of book.
Yeah. I liked that answer too, though, that like, it's this, for a lot of people, it's like their benchmark for that you made it, right? But as we've kind of seen in this conversation, so is a podcast. Like, it's that other way of getting to know you further. Like, you obviously get to know an author, through 300 pages, but through a year's worth of episodes, you learn a lot more too. So I like that as well.
Yeah. And the other thing I'll say is, look, I mean, the way that people communicate today is completely different from the way that they communicated 10 or 15 years ago. The way that people like to, people are spending more time on Instagram and TikTok and Facebook and things like that. That's what they're consuming these days. So does writing a 300-page book that no one's going to read serve you? Yeah. Maybe it doesn't, or like, does doing podcast interviews that you can share a link and someone can download it and they can listen to it while they're walking the dog or while they're driving in the car, but they're going to consume it, compared to a book they're not going to touch, which is going to serve you more, Yeah. Or if you can take that podcast interview, you can slice it and dice it, and you can create this micro content that you share across social media, so that you've got a presence and you're sharing content over the course of a year. Is that going to serve you in a greater way? So you have to really ask, what's going to serve you the best.
Yeah. If you're going to serve your ego in that case, or, serve yourself professionally and your personal brand.
Yeah. Right.
So, we're obviously a smaller show. Do you have any kind of like closing, tips for us, like a last little, closing statement?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, look, I mean, 10, 11 years ago now is when I started, just took the time with one person over a video, it was Skype video at the time, but Zoom these days, took the time to have a conversation. It doesn't take that much effort. You can do it. You can come up with questions to ask. It won't be perfect, but you got to start with something that's a little bit sloppy and you'll get better at it. So I just tell people I'm a huge evangelist for the medium. In our company, Rise25, we can only serve a very small segment of the market, the companies that we help. But beyond that, I just want to be an evangelist for the medium because so many great things have flowed to my life from taking the time to go and feature people, interview people, help preserve their legacy, help share their story and their work that they're doing with the world in my own small way. Mm-hmm. And so I would encourage all of your listeners to explore that. Think about it. Don't just be a passive consumer of listening to a podcast, but think about, how can I do this and do it in a way that's going to be strategically beneficial to me so that I am motivated to keep doing it, even when I'm busy, even when I have other things going on, so that I keep this as a discipline and I keep on doing it, because the name of the game is to keep doing it, to have longevity. That's where you get the real benefit from it and doing it over time. So that's just what I would leave for your listeners.
Yeah. We appreciate that a lot. And the idea of giving back too is really helpful for shows like us, and keep spreading the word that this is a medium worth pursuing.
Yeah, for sure.
Do you want to close, Austin?
Yeah, well, we again appreciate your time on here. Kind of shout out to my uncle, one of the hosts of Pitcher This podcast, kind of getting this set up and introducing us to each other. One of the things that I'm just happy you mentioned real quick at the end here is that that make sure that you're doing something that you're passionate about, as I think is really important. Ben and I wouldn't probably be 37 episodes in if we didn't find a passion about it. And I think the longevity speaks to that of your podcast. Clearly you have passion for it, and clearly that you want to resonate that passion with other people and sort of be a spokesperson for the medium, right? Because it is often, as podcasts are being formed, as they are a lot today, almost everybody that we know is either in the talks of making one or has one or, listens to them. It's a very consumable source of information. And just to know that there's somebody out there that's, looking out for that, for people like us, like Ben and I, as well as other people, it's remarkable, and we appreciate it. So thank you.
My pleasure, guys. My pleasure. Great to meet you guys.
Yep. We'll see you next week.
Yep.
Thanks, guys.